Well, hello, community of believers. So glad to be with you, and appreciate all the prayers. We've had some really good things going on in our little in our community, and Lord is just really good to us. Nancy had surgery yesterday, and she is recovering and seems to be doing pretty well. Doctor was very pleased with the results, so I'm glad that that has is behind us, and that she's recovering, which is great. And you all know that Rick is doing really well, and that's really exciting to see that the Lord is healing up his body, and he's doing really well. Um, and and what a great report for our little Eli, as we've been just praying for him over and over again, and you know what? They get all the cancer. I'm sure the treatments that are ongoing are still not easy, and we need to continue to pray. But what a miraculous, turn of events that they were actually able to do surgery on him. And so, we all just rejoice at what we see the Lord doing and how he intervenes in the lives of everyday humans and loves us so well. And so, anyway, hope you guys kept up the last couple of weeks as Rick was doing a teaching kind of along the lines of just the unseen realm, understanding that there's powers and principalities that are at work, and we see that everywhere we go, we see the effect of that. The Lord talks about that, how his spirit moves, but there are spiritual activities that are happening all around us, and Jesus talks about, he says, you can see the effect of the wind, as it blows in the trees and as it moves things around, and but you can't see the wind itself, and it doesn't make it any less real. It's there, and there can be no denying that, and we're seeing that. And things are shifting and shaping and changing around the globe. What's going on in Israel is, right in the eye of that storm that's going on, and what will happen with Iran. And then we have our elections that are coming up, and those things are battlegrounds at times for, spiritual entities that are at work, and so. So as we keep that in mind, I just want to encourage you guys to keep that perspective in your head and your heart as we walk these things out, and that we live for a different coming kingdom. There's a coming kingdom that the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings will come and rule on the earth. And that's where our hope is. Our hope is not in, one political party or another, or one nation or another. It really is in Jesus Christ and him crucified, and his spirit leading his people on this earth. We live for an alternative culture, an alternative lifestyle, and an alternative kingdom to what's going on around us. We are in the world, but not of the world, as the Bible tells us. And Jesus lived that out as an example, but also not just an example, but the empowerment of his spirit for us to live like he did. And he lived a little different than the rest of the world. He wasn't swayed by the intensity of what we're maybe fearful of, because he lived for an eternal perspective more than he lived for the temporal one. But that understanding gives us impetus and wind behind our sails when we think about preaching the gospel, the eternal nature of man's souls and the people that are all around us. And we're moved so many times by the election is coming up. We're moved by these national entities, and you do realize that when you start looking at the scripture, that nations come and go, that political boundaries change. Different nations are raised up and then they're brought down. Nations, political boundaries, political parties are not eternal. But the person you bump into at the grocery store, as we live out our everyday lives, they have an eternal soul. They have an eternity set before them. Nations don't. They're not going to last. But that one person, the people that we walk out our lives every day, our value system needs to be aligned with the Word of God more than it is aligned with the culture that's all around us and what's transpiring. It's those people that we talk to, those people in our families, they're all eternal. They have an eternal destiny. And the kingdoms of this world come and go. And the political parties in this world come and go, but we live for an alternative kingdom and a different way of life that's rooted and grounded in the eternal. And that's where we put our hope. And so, Rick I thought he did a great job just talking about the reality of that spirit realm that's there, and how things can transpire in the world around us, and they can take us by surprise. We've talked about some of these things in the past. How did the virus of COVID all of a sudden flip the world on its ear in a moment's time? And you think, there's something more going on here than just the fear of a virus that certainly costs lives, but comparatively speaking to things like the plague and stuff that's gone on in the past, even the Spanish flu, the rate of death was pretty low. But it changed the fiber of culture. It changed and you think, there are powers and principalities that are at work. And then when you start looking at what's going on in the Middle East, in the book of Daniel talks about the Prince of Persia. When Daniel was praying and asking God for an interpretation for this end time apocalyptic dream that he had, that he sent Michael the archangel, but Michael was thwarted for 21 days by he was in a pitched battle with the Prince of Persia. Somehow I think the Prince of Persia is still at work. And the Prince of Persia is Iran. That is that land, and that people group. And so, when you start plugging these things in, it makes a little bit more sense. And that our fight is not against the people that we come in contact with. It's powers and principalities that are at work. our enemy isn't our neighbor. We're to love our neighbor, no matter how they're influenced. But, deception is real, and those things are out there. But we know the truth, and the truth is in a person, and that person is Christ Jesus. And so we had a few weeks, and I gave a couple of weeks about history and about history of government and history of socialism and how things have come into place. And I hope you guys can listen to those things. We gave an introduction. Then Rick talked about that spiritual realm and how that affects even nations, and those things are all really important. And wanted to give you kind of a biblical background, a biblical perspective, that we're not shaken and moved by, the polling of this nation. Who's going to win the election here and what's going to go on, and we can lose our cool doing that kind of stuff. We keep our eyes focused upon the reality of the spirit realm and the Lord, and knowing that He's the answer and that our hope is in Him. And that things are going to be unfolding, and a lot of those end time things are unfolding in the Middle East. And so we're going to keep our eyes on that, and keep in prayer and in hope of the coming greatness of our God, who sustains us in this present evil age, who intervenes in the lives of our families and who we are, and also has the promise of a coming kingdom. And so we're going to dive back into the book of John, the Gospel of John, I should say. And what I'm hoping is that we'll kind of finish up the Gospel of John at the end of this year. And then we will dive into the book of Revelation. And really, I don't really want to just limit it to the book of Revelation, but we'll talk a little bit about, John's writing. So John, we went through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then here we are on the Gospel of John, and then the other book that he wrote is the book of Revelation. And so we're gonna take some time at the beginning of the year to dive into further writing by our friend John the Apostle, and then coordinate that with the understanding of the book of Daniel, the book of Isaiah, and the book of Ezekiel, and also coordinate that with some of the things that Jesus told us in the Gospels about the end of the age, and kind of put it together a little bit and try to bale the hay a little bit and just point in that direction as we enter into some really interesting days. But where we left off in the Gospel of John, we finished up chapter 12. I believe that was our last one. We talked about Lazarus and the beauty of that resurrection story, and pretty amazing thing. We talked a little bit about that the Greeks came and recognized it. The Gentiles are hearing about Jesus, and they come to seek Him, and it's at that moment that Jesus says, "My time has come," because the rest of the world now needs to be redeemed and brought into the fold, and not exclusionary to the Jewish people, but grafted into that understanding of the revelation that God has given through the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way to Malachi, and bringing us to that point and revealing then the Messiah who has come to redeem all of mankind. And so we see that in chapter 12, and the Greeks coming and Jesus recognizing and saying, the hour has come. And so these last chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21, they're all compacted into this one short period of time, right at the end of Christ's life. And we hear John's memory and the Spirit of God racing through John's experience as he writes down and gives us the revelation of these last days of Jesus on the earth and how very important they were. And so chapter 13 starts with, a pretty well-known set of scriptures. I'll just read, a couple of verses to you guys real quick. So before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing his hour had come and that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Just verse 1. And so you find the context here of these last days of Christ coincide with the Passover story. Right at the time that Passover is going on. And so he gathers his loved ones, his disciples, and he gathers them in the upper room or wherever the room was that they were going to celebrate Passover. We like to think that communion is some kind of a new revelation about a new thing. But without the context of understanding what Jesus is doing at the time and who he is and where he's coming from and what he's celebrating and what's transpiring, we don't really fully understand the story. We argue then about things that are not really even headlines in that story. And so, but he gathers his disciples together, and they're in this room, and they're getting ready to have their Passover meal. They're very Jewish, very very Orthodox in their practicing Judaism, and this was an important time for all the Jewish people as they come together to remember how God intervened and drew them out of slavery, out of the bondage of Israel, set them free from that sin, and brought them out, which is such a great picture of what Jesus does. He comes. And how did that transpire? We'll have to take a look at that story a little bit as we move along here. But the first thing that Jesus does, he gathers these guys together, and then he does this really unusual thing. They're all sitting in the room, and Jesus grabs a bowl of water and a towel, and he serves these humans that he has poured his life into. 12 men, along with many others that were very important to him. You think about the story of Lazarus, you think about, Mary and Martha, you think about Mary Magdalene, you think about Jesus's mother. There's so many that are part of that circle of influence that Jesus had. And yet he takes these guys that he chose to be his messengers. That's what apostle means, that they were going to be messengers to the rest of the world, to those Greeks that were seeking him out. And so he's only got a few short hours. And what is he going to say? And what is he going to do? All of a sudden, these things become very important. And John is recalling this, and he gathers these guys in this room. And the thing that he does is he shows what a leader really does. A leader in this kingdom that's coming. A leader lays his life down and that he serves those that are around him. And Jesus does something that is, considered only the lowest of the low would do. And he washes their feet. It's one of the last acts that he does to show who he really is and to tell his apostles, his disciples, and say, this is how you're supposed to live your life. And he does it not only through his voice, but he actually lives it out, and he does something that is what the lowest of the low is supposed to do. And he walks in humility, and he washes these guys' feet, and Peter, speaking for the rest of the crew there, he's always kind of that mouthpiece. And I love Peter. He's so great. He says, well, Jesus, you shouldn't be washing my feet. What are you doing? Let me wash you. And Jesus makes this incredible statement, and he says, if I don't wash you, then you have no part of me. And then Peter, in his enthusiasm, says, well, then don't just wash my feet, wash all of me. And Jesus is just going, you're not understanding what the point is here. I'm going to wash your feet, but I want you guys to live in a way that prefers the other over above yourself, and do things and serve one another like I serve you. That's what he's come to do. And he's doing it to such an extreme that he knows his time is short on the earth, so he's going to lay his life down physically. He's going to die on behalf of those that he's going to serve. And unless he washes us with his blood, unless he washes mankind and opens the door for the Gentile world to come into the fold, unless he does this, we can't have a part of him. It's a stunning thing. It's the gospel package that he's laying out for mankind in the last hours of his life. That example should propel us on to serve as the number one thing that we do, because that's what Jesus did. He came to serve. He served the Father's glory. He served his own place as the King of Kings. And he served his apostles and disciples. And he served the rest of mankind, including you and I. That's how we are to live our lives. Serving for God's glory, serving for the King of Kings and the coming King that's going to set up his kingdom on this earth in time to come. And to serve one another the way Jesus served, with humility and power and grace and hope, seeing others in the light of their eternal perspective, their eternity, like I talked about at the beginning of this, where the importance that we place upon nations and political parties and all that other stuff when they're not eternal things. But the humans that sit around with us on a daily basis are eternal. And Jesus is recognizing this, and that he will turn the world upside down by doing things that are really different than the way the rest of the world does it. The rest of the world is trying to climb on others in order to get above on the ladder of success, on the ladder of power. And Jesus says it's the opposite in his kingdom. And he gives this example in this chapter. And so he washes their feet. He makes the proclamation that Peter's going to deny him. He knows what's coming. It's a weighty moment of time, heavy upon his heart. And yet he gives this example and takes the lowly position. Shouldn't we do that? I think I should be living that way. And I need to be reminded of that. And I'm sure our whole community does. We need to live that way, where even in the midst of turmoil, and in the midst of fear, and in the midst of polarization in our country, and violence that is happening globally, Jesus was dealing with the same thing, the same kind of Roman Empire stuff that was going on. And there was fear in the room to some degree that those apostles may have, if they believed the Lord, they would know that things are heating up. They can see, they know. Jesus has told them. In the midst of that, Jesus does this very simple serving act that reverberates for eternity in his word and shows us the reality of how he has called us to live as believers and following the Lord. So then, he accomplishes this statement that he's making, this teaching that he's giving by his very actions. And then they have a Passover meal. We know the story. You remember the story? Moses and, the angel of death comes and passes over those houses that have the blood on the doors, and the sacrificial lamb is given, and they take the hyssop, the herbs, and they coat the doors so that the angel of death will pass over. You think about that in reality, that's a moment in time, isn't it? Used to celebrate that with my kids, that we would take water and paint it on the door lintels, and then we'd have a Passover meal and remember, what was going on. But it's just a foreshadowing of what Christ is about to do. Understanding the picture that was given in the Passover is what is going on at the first communion service. That he is the sacrificial lamb, that he is the one that would be slaughtered, that he will have the blood over the door of our hearts and the door of our dwellings. that picture was so poignant for those Jewish believers that they understood what Jesus was trying to say. And when Jesus says, this is my blood, this is my body, we've argued as Christians and divided over, is that really the body and the blood of Christ? Does it magically transform into that? Or, that many of the Roman Catholics believe that, or the Lutherans believe that it's the presence of God is on and under those things. And then the Reformed believe that it's just symbolic. And, we argue about those kind of things and miss the whole fact that this is a celebration of Passover. This was a Jewish holiday. This was a remembrance of a deliverance that took place a couple of thousand years prior to that. That this picture was what Jesus was about to step into, and that his Jewish followers knew exactly what he was talking about. And that he was going to be the sacrificial lamb. And that communion would be taken in remembrance, just like the Passover meal was taken, in remembrance of what was done. And that it forms and shapes the very theology and the very practice of everyday life. When we submit ourselves to the sacrificial lamb who gave up his life and covered our sin, so therefore now we can walk in the freedom and the deliverance that he proclaims. Wow. This is a moment that should be remembered. And we shouldn't be, just arguing with one another about, well, did he really mean this, or is it supposed to be worked out this way? And if you don't believe this, then you can't, and I just look at it and I think, no. This was a Jewish holiday that he was celebrating. This was the unleavened bread that he was partaking in. This was a proclamation. And then the very things that I think he just washed his disciples' feet, told them to prefer one another, serve one another. Don't be in the place where you're going to hate one another over some of the details. I just think, oh my gosh, can we embrace a little bit of the understanding of what he's trying to get across? Some of the very things that he tells us, to do, we don't take those to heart like we should. Somehow I don't think that Ulrich Zwingli and Martin Luther would have screamed at one another, walked out of their colloquy in the time of the Reformation and called one another heretics if they could partially embrace the very nature of what Christ had just done in washing the disciples' feet, considering them more important, seeing them as eternal beings, and then celebrating the Passover and the picture of the freedom that he will now proclaim to all people who will come under the blood, as the doors were painted in those days with the blood of the Lamb and the Passover meal. It wasn't all about the how-tos. It was all about the reality and the revelation of who Christ is and what he has done and what he will do. And our hope in another kingdom. that's based upon him and his truth and his way. And it's an upside down kingdom where the greatest is the least and the best leader is the servant of all. And he plays this out in such picture perfect way through this gospel message. So, what do we walk away with? I mean, what do we do in this? Well, first off, if we go back and look at the last several weeks, and we talk about the fact that our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. Jesus even talks about it when he addresses Judas in that Last Supper, and he turns to him and says, "What you're going to do it quickly." And immediately in this scripture it says, and Satan, the Satan, which is a really interesting term in Jewish theology and understanding of the spirit realm. That word Satan was not so much a person as it was a title. It was the accuser. And there are lots of spiritual beings that were out there that were the accusers. So whatever the spiritual being was that came into Judas at that time. And all of a sudden, Judas was not the one that was animating his thoughts, his mind, his heart, and his body. There was an accuser that was there. The Satan was right there. Spirit realm is very real. These guys understood it. So should we. Understanding that even in this election season that I can't wait for it to be over, our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. And God is moving and shaping and molding, and he will have his way. And we, as a people of another kingdom, and that other kingdom is coming and will rule on this earth in really tangible, real ways. It isn't sitting on a cloud playing a harp. It is the reality of God's kingdom coming to earth, and he will be a king, and he will rule over the nations. They're his inheritance. That's where hope is. We look at that, And yet we've been given the privilege of being able to have a little bit of a say-so in our nation anyway. Unusual thing. I don't want to go back and redo those teachings, but hey, I would tell you, go vote. But let your voting be for righteousness. Not just for some party, and not just for some political system that we're just infected by. But when we vote, we look at eternity. We say, what's the best way that we can freely proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ? And what's the best way that these things can go forward on an eternal basis? Weigh it out according to those things, not according to what the media is telling you on either side of the aisle. So there's probably truth a little bit everywhere. I don't know, I've already voted. And I would say it's important. Do it. But no matter what the outcome of the vote is, no matter what comes of this election, we are a people that is set aside, that's different than the rest of the world. We have a kingdom that's coming that will overshadow everything that man can do on this evil age. And that we will stand no matter what party's in power or even what nation is in power. The believers in China, that church is growing by leaps and bounds, even under the harshest, ugly persecution of an ugly system that I believe should be brought down and that God will judge in time to come. But we as God's people, we live as an alternative culture, an alternative people. And we invite all those to come. Come and join us, because we have peace and joy and hope. Even in the face of persecution, even in the face of difficulty, even in the face of things happening that we don't like. Doesn't mean you have to like it. But we have the Spirit of God dwelling in us. And these next chapters that are coming up, 14, 15, and 16, are the promise that Jesus is not going to leave us alone, but he's going to give his Spirit to us. And his Spirit's going to dwell in his people. And that when his Spirit dwells in us, the fruit of the Spirit, because the Spirit dwells there, the fruit of the Spirit will be evident. And we can walk in peace, love, joy, hope, kindness, gentleness, no matter what our circumstances are in this present evil age. And that we can live in the example that Christ gave, where he laid his life down for us. And that he gave the example of how to lead by getting on his knees and washing the feet of his disciples. Well, God bless you guys. I always look forward to just diving into the Word. It's just so good. I would just tell you, read chapter 13. Let it affect you a little bit. Let it affect your mind and your will and your emotions. Let it affect you a little bit. And how then do we take that example that Christ gave of serving and then the proclamation of his death on behalf of mankind, that he was willing to lay his life down? How do we do that for our families? How do we do that for our neighbors? How do we do that in our nation? And it should be very practical. Love is not just an emotional feeling. It's an actual practice of life. And Jesus practiced it in very practical ways. And I want to encourage you guys, how do we serve one another? Can we make that phone call? Can we do that meal for somebody that's in need? Can we write that little note for somebody to encourage them? Do we see them through the eyes of heaven? Do we see them the way Christ sees them, as an eternal being that is made in his image? Can we serve one another in such a way that the rest of the world looks in and goes, what are they doing? How does that work? They seem to really love one another. But we need to do that in a really practical way. Can we live that way as a community? I hope, I pray, and I believe that God is calling us to that very thing. So dive into the Word, start praying, and start doing. by reaching and loving those that are around us and serving them in the way you can, in the small things that really do count. That example of Jesus washing those disciples' feet is a small thing. And yet it reverberates and leaps off the page as an example of something that's profound. And it's talked about now for thousands of years because it's profound. So what are the small things you can do for your spouse, for your children? What are the small things that you can do for your neighbor, for the people in our community, for those that are in need at times, and even for those that are not in need for the moment, but could use the encouragement and the love and the expression? Well, God bless you guys. Have a great week, and we will see you Sunday morning, and we'll be praying again for one another and having communion, which is pictured so great in this chapter. All right. Love you guys. Heart is with you. Thanks.